Good morning and welcome to concurrent paper session 1A. We're grateful to our two presenters today, as well as to our featured respondent, Ken Himes. By way of introduction, Father Himes is a Catholic priest and a Franciscan. Since 2004, he has been a professor of theological ethics here at Boston College, prior to which he taught at Washington Theological Union. He has published more articles than a summary would give justice to, and has authored a handful of manuscripts, including Fullness of Faith, The Public Significance of Theology, which won Best Theology Book from the Catholic Press Association, responses to 101 questions on Catholic social teaching, Christianity and the Political Order, Conflict, Cooperation, and, Conflict, Co-optation, and Cooperation, which won Best Book on Social Teaching from the Catholic Press Association as well, and Drones and the Ethics of Targeted Killings. So welcome to Professor Himes. Before we begin, I would like to quickly describe the format for our session. Each presenter will have 15 to 20 minutes for their presentation. After the two presentations, Father Himes will offer his response, and with any remaining time, we will open up to questions from the audience. Given the crowd that we have here, I ask that you please use the raise hand function found by clicking the reactions tab at the bottom of your screen. Or if you really don't like public speaking, you're welcome to write your question directly to me in the chat function, and I'm happy to ask the question on your behalf. So we'll begin today with Martin Chan. Martin is a student at Yale Divinity School, pursuing a concentrated Master of Art in religion with a focus on theology. Today, Martin will be sharing with us his paper entitled Xenophobic Identity Formation, a Political Theological Response to State Sovereignty. So Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you for the kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. Today, I'm going to talk about xenophobia and state sovereignty. Xenophobia is a major problem in the United States today, a problem exemplified by anti-immigration discourses and policies. Xenophobia is not only about the fear and exclusion of foreigners or otherness. Fundamentally, it reflects the worldview in which identities are defined in oppositional terms. While scholars have pointed out how state sovereignty has been used by xenophobia to implement anti-immigrant actions, not enough attention has been given to analyze how state sovereignty itself as a political ideology leads to xenophobia. My thesis today is that the ideology of nation-state sovereignty dehumanizes immigrants by mandating xenophobic identity formations, because such formations suppress human natality, an essence of the image bearers of God. The following presentation is divided into 4 parts. First, I'll briefly define state and nation-state sovereignty. Second, drawing from examples in the US and Taiwan context, I'll illustrate how nation-state sovereignty mandates xenophobic identity formations. After that, I'll lay out a theology of identity formation and argue that nation-state sovereignty is dehumanizing. And finally, I'll propose a vision of solidarity in alterity. So state sovereignty is a political ideology that grants a state the final authority over a bounded geographical area. Geographer Bernard Nietzsche defines a state as a centralized political system within international legal boundaries recognized by other states that uses a civilian military bureaucracy to establish one government and to enforce one set of institutions and laws. This oneness of governance is basically the sovereignty of the state, since the singular civilian military bureaucracy is the ultimate authority within the territory. Now, very importantly, state sovereignty as understood in the world today is owned by the nation within the state, which is often referred to as the people. This means that it is the nation that holds the final authority over the state territory. This understanding is evident in both Chinese and American political thinking. Yang Qichao, a Chinese reformist and intellect who was active when China transitioned from a monarchy to a republic, combined guo, this is the state, and min, the people, to coin the new term guomin, nationals, in the hope that an ever-increasing number of self-conscious nationals would turn China into a strong modern nation state. This new term signals a fundamental change in the relation between the people and the state. Before, the people were simply living in the state's territory owned by the ruler. Now the people actually own the territory of the state, which is why people proudly say, "This is my country." This is the same in the US. As stated in the preamble to the Constitution, it is the people of the US who have final authority over the Constitution and therefore the state. So, how does nation-state sovereignty affect identity formation? As I said a moment ago, state sovereignty is about having the final authority over a territory, which is to claim territorial inviolability. This means that no external authorities are allowed to perform governing functions within the state's territory. This inviolability is then appropriated by the nation. And this is how it works. As the state is nationalized, the nation is in turn territorialized. The territorial boundary of the state becomes the boundary of the nation. This means that for the nation, the final authority over state's territory is translated into the final authority over the national community. State sovereignty becomes national sovereignty. And since state sovereignty entails territorial inviolability, national sovereignty entails the inviolability of the nation, which in diplomatic terms means outsiders should not interfere with the internal affair of our nation. Presuming the nation as inviolable is effectively enclosing it, which in turn leads to the sacralization of the national identity. As Nazi linguist George Trier said, the enclosure gave birth to the shrine by removing it from the ordinary. Enclosing something is to sacralize it. Although it is impossible in this globalized world to completely enclose a nation from external influences, the ideological presumption that the national community should be inviolable already forms an imaginary enclosure, which leads to the belief that the integrity of the nation rests on its purity, ethno-racial, cultural-political, or a combination of both. This belief stresses that the integrity of the nation depends on protecting the fixedness or sacrosanctity of the national identity. As sacralization entails the exclusion of the profane, a sacrosanct national identity requires the negation of otherness. Consequently, this forms a worldview that sees identities in oppositional terms, which is the root of xenophobia. Let's take a look at some examples in the US. According to constitutional scholar Matthew Spalding, the vision of the Founding Fathers regarding immigration is that men and women would be free to come to America from every country in the world, but only if they became Americans. Former Speaker of the US House of Representatives Newt Gingrich also said something similar. He claimed that failing to require immigrants to absolutely and entirely denounce all previous political allegiances is incompatible with the moral basis of American constitutional democracy. This means that for immigrants to be accepted as authentic members of the American nation, they are required to convert their identity into the authentic American national identity. For example, some see the failure of Hispanic immigrants to learn English and their efforts to form cultural linguistic enclaves as a threat to the American national identity. These insistence on mandatory conversion to authentic Americanism reflects the ideology of national sovereignty, that the American nation is only intact, alive, in full integrity when its national identity remains unchanged, and when all members adopt that identity. In other words, the American national identity becomes sacred, and to keep something sacred requires the exclusion of anything that might contaminate it. So for immigrants to become authentic nationals, they have to be willing to and capable of getting rid of aspects of their identities that are incompatible with the American national identity, including cultural, religious, political, and linguistic aspects. Because of nation-state sovereignty, immigrants are mandated to exorcise their old self in order to adopt an American self. They are forced to be xenophobic against themselves. Similar things happen in Taiwan as well. Although Taiwan is not formally recognized as a state in many international contexts, it is de facto a sovereign state, given its independent civilian and military bureaucracy. However, its sovereignty has been under contention for decades as the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, has been insisting that the sovereignty of Taiwan belongs to it. In order to protect Taiwan's sovereignty from the PRC, former Taiwan President Li Denghui insisted that it is necessary to construct a solid Taiwanese identity as the core of Taiwan's nation-state sovereignty. Specifically, this solid Taiwanese identity is largely conditioned on de-Sinicization and often set against Chineseness. A group that vividly experienced this xenophobic identity formation was the mainland Chinese spouses of Taiwanese people who had immigrated from mainland China to Taiwan. In an interview conducted in 2002 with one of these mainland Chinese spouses, the interviewee said, "Often Taiwanese people ask me why mainland Chinese spouses, once they have obtained Taiwanese ID, are still faithful to China. They believe that this is cheating Taiwan." Taiwan studies scholars Chen Yi Li and Lara Momesso observed that, especially in the first half of the 2000s, seeing its national sovereignty as threatened by the arrival of migrants from mainland China, the Taiwanese government made every effort to exclude these migrants from its nation-building project. As a consequence, mainland Chinese marriage migrants not only felt excluded, but also did not dare to manifest pride for their Chinese identity in public spaces or in front of other Taiwanese citizens. For these immigrants from mainland China, they were prohibited from maintaining and performing their Chinese national identity because it was seen as incompatible with the Taiwanese national identity. At the same time, they were also prohibited from constructing Taiwanese identities that embrace hybridity between the two nations. Again, we can see the ideology of nation-state sovereignty at work here. There was a presumption that the integrity of the Taiwanese nation can only be preserved by protecting its inviolability, which specifically means protecting the nation from the intrusion of pro-PRC identities. Within the sovereign nation of Taiwan, anti-PRC becomes a sacred aspect of the Taiwanese national identity, and immigrants are required to adopt such xenophobia into their identities if they want to be seen as an authentic Taiwanese. So, what's wrong with xenophobic identity formations from a theological perspective? I find Namsun Kang's Theology of Natality very helpful for answering this question. Natality is a concept Kang borrowed from Hannah Arendt, and it basically means human birth. Kang argues that natality is an ontological nature of the image bearers of God. This means that human beings should be defined by their birth, or theologically speaking, their creation. Kang sees each human as singularly and uniquely created by God, which is to say that God creates each human as completely new, unlike any human before. For Kang, this capacity to bring newness into the world is the essence of human natality. For her, to be human is to embody an ever-present possibility to bring newness. Importantly, this is not just about the possibility to do something new, but also the possibility to be new. Identity formations that reflect human natality should encourage the constant possibility of renewing oneself, of creating new subjecthood, or as Jesus told Nicodemus, of ever becoming born again. The human being is not born with an identity, but with possibilities. This means that human uniqueness is actualized by de-essentializing human beings from their identities. And for Kang, this is achieved by the deterritorialization of certainty and fixity of who one is, and the defamiliarization of one's socio-cultural custom. Miroslav Volf's idea of Catholic personality encapsulates how humans could do these. He said, a Catholic personality is a personality enriched by otherness, a personality that is what it is only because multiple others have been reflected in it in a particular way. End of quote. Indeed, only by taking in what's unfamiliar can humans defamiliarize. Only by incorporating what's outside of the territory can humans deterritorialize. Only by embracing otherness can human beings constantly reborn. Therefore, as God's image bearers defined by natality, identity formation should be hybrid and fluid. Unfortunately, By mandating xenophobic identity formations, nation-state sovereignty dehumanizes immigrants because their natality is fundamentally suppressed. As we saw in the US and Taiwan examples, the ideology of nation-state sovereignty mandates immigrants to adopt a national identity that is xenophobic. The problem here is not that aspects of the immigrants' original identities are being deemed as foreign or other. That is not the problem. The problem is that nation-state sovereignty requires them to exclude these aspects of foreignness and otherness within them. By doing so, immigrants are stripped of their freedom to experiment with different ways of being a member of their new nation. For example, in the US context, Hispanic immigrants should have the freedom to explore ways to be Americans without needing to learn English. Or Muslims should be given the opportunities to incorporate Islamic values into their civic engagement as authentic members of the American nation. Similarly, in the Taiwanese context, immigrants from mainland China should have a space to experiment with constructing a Taiwanese identity that embodies the tension of competing sovereignty, or a Taiwanese identity that is more place-based than territorial-based. Unfortunately, because of nation-state sovereignty, defending the purity of the national identity becomes a necessary condition for maintaining the integrity of the nation. As a result, nation-state sovereignty prohibits fluid and hybrid identity formations, which suppresses immigrants of their divinely endowed nature to constantly renew themselves. Nevertheless, there are situations when the failure to create or sustain a collective identity could lead to the annihilation of certain cultural political identities. This is commonly the case for colonized communities or when a weaker nation is under the threat of being engulfed by a stronger nation, as we are witnessing right now. In these cases, it is often necessary for the colonized or weaker community to rally around a common identity in order to achieve or protect the right of self-determination. Kang acknowledges the importance of this kind of solidarity that is built upon commonality. However, with profound insight, she stresses that this type of solidarity in sameness should be only strategic and context-specific, not permanent and context-unlimited. Building on philosopher Giorgio Agamben's concept of inessential commonality, she proposes an alternative vision to solidarity in sameness, which is solidarity in authority. She writes, "There is an inessential commonality in we, and what matters the most in the solidarity of the we-ness in authority, it's one's existence as coexistence, but not one's existence as coessence." This means that it is reasonable, oftentimes even admirable, for people to rally around a common cause, like the pursuit of self-determination. However, even when one is fully devoted to this common cause, this should not undermine human natality because it is a core essence of humanity. Therefore, the pursuit of self-determination via a collective we-ness should always allow or even prioritize the constant creation of new subjecthood within the community. One can certainly criticize this vision of solidarity in authority as idealistic, because I'm essentially arguing for self-determination without nation-state sovereignty. Self-determination without nation-state sovereignty. I agree that within a world order where sovereign states are virtually the only truly self-determined entities, a community needs sovereignty to secure genuine self-determinations. Despite the necessity of defending the necessary evil of nation-state sovereignty, I think it is still possible for each member of the nation to resist against xenophobic identity formations. Indeed, doing so could lead to exclusion, hatred, abuses, imprisonment, even death. However, in order to preserve our God-given humanity and the humanity of the excluded others, it is imperative for human beings to resist the xenophobic logic of nation-state sovereignty and embrace otherness. Because it is this embrace of otherness that actualizes human natality, which is what makes human beings image bearers of God. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. We appreciate that. We'll now turn to Kevin Frazier. Kevin Frazier is a student at the Harvard Kennedy School and UC Berkeley School of Law. He will graduate with a Master's of Public Administration and his JD in May. His work experience in big tech generated his academic focus on the intersection of technology and society. Today, he will be presenting a paper entitled "The Secular Bottom Line: Why Corporate America Left Religion."
Thank you again for this opportunity. I wanted to start by thanking Professor Richard Parker of the Harvard Kennedy School for inspiring me to write this paper. I was a part of Professor Parker's class, Religion and Public Policy, this last semester, and he did an excellent job of pushing students to think more deeply about how religion has been such a factor in the development of our public policy and our governance since the colonial era, and obviously well before that. This course is such an important asset, and I sincerely hope that the Kennedy School and schools in a similar position will make sure that their students learn about religious organizations and beliefs and their influence on public policy, so that we all have a more firm understanding of why continued attention to religious beliefs and organizations is critical to thinking about public policy problems. And I'd also like to see schools like the UC Berkeley School of Law, where I'm currently a law school student, also encourage students to more deeply consider how religion is impacting the law and people's perception of the law. Before I go too much further, I also wanted to explain why I find this topic, the interests of corporations and the interests of religious organizations and individuals, so fascinating. I grew up religious just outside of Portland, Oregon, and we like to call that area the Emerald Valley, a greener, more forested version of Silicon Valley, where innovation and tech similarly is growing all of the time. And if you don't know much about Portland, you probably know that it's one of the least churched areas of the entire country. And yet I never really felt much out of place for having religious beliefs in that area. However, when I did move to the actual Silicon Valley, down in San Francisco, and started working for big tech companies, I did feel something in the atmosphere that made having religious beliefs feel incongruous with the corporate interests and the corporate culture. And so when I was able to take this course with Professor Parker, I wanted to dive into this topic further. And this paper really outlines some theories of why corporate interests and religious interests have diverged over time. I present 3 theories of why that divergence has occurred. None of them are mutually exclusive, but I think all of them are very compelling. So it's important first to see when corporate interests and religious interests have aligned. In the colonial era, the source of that alignment was generally from the fact that religious organizations had a tremendous amount of capital and had the ability to make projects overseas actually feasible. And so corporate leaders often found themselves having very strong ties to religious organizations to make sure that their profitable endeavors could occur. Later in the Reconstruction era South and the early 20th century, when especially in the South and also in parts of the North, having a reliable, stable, and productive workforce was extremely important. Corporate interests and religious interests aligned for a slightly different reason, and that was really to ensure that workers would have those attributes that were critical to profitability. I discuss in my paper how post-Civil War South really made religious participation a prerequisite to any sort of employment or any really civic role in society. And I hypothesize that that interest and that insistence in religious participation really had to do with making sure that corporations could identify workers that had a similar cultural belief and obviously approach to work, and having that sort of consistency and reliability assisted with profits and assisted with generally the expansion of that same model where workers were really cogs in a system. Over time, workers being cogs in the system freed corporations a little bit, as they were able to become less and less reliant on workers alone. For example, Ford identifying ways to increase automation. Corporations were able to distance themselves from caring so deeply about making sure that their workers adhered to similar beliefs or insisted on following the same sort of schedules and having the same sort of work ethic, because they simply became less important to making sure that cars got built or things got shipped and things like that. So over time, corporations were able to distance themselves from that reliance on the actual worker. Then we see a real divergence start to emerge. And that was when the economy was no longer solely contingent on producing goods and moved towards a more service and innovation-based economy. We also see that corporations no longer had to rely solely on religious organizations for capital, and that was via an increased rate of public ownership. So as we see things that used to be really contingent on labor and having a strong, reliable workforce that was just cogs in the system, we see innovations like, yes, the washer machine begin to free people to focus on more tasks at home where the religious interests may be of more value, and freeing corporations then to prioritize different things and care less necessarily about what was going on in the home and what the religious beliefs of their workers were. We also see that as innovation occurred, the country changed in terms of its geographic destiny. Here you see that the density of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics occupations, or STEM occupations, really changed once we were able to have people live in the Sun Belt, for example. And as people moved, their ties to some of those religious institutions that used to be so strong in the Northeast and the South of the country became more tenuous. And that freed people to pursue different means of understanding the world. And oftentimes that pursuit of a different way of understanding the world came through these very STEM degree programs and obviously jobs. And the further disconnection of corporations with religious institutions was also a product of this geographic shift, where once again, there was no longer such a heavy tie and connection between corporations receiving capital or anything like that from religious institutions, leaning on that public ownership to be able to move to any place in the country. And we've seen that over time, this geographic destiny of science and technology moving to different parts of the country, and typically least churched parts of the country, has passed an intergenerational sense of either religiosity or lack thereof onto future generations of Americans. So here we're seeing the origins of inventors, patent rates where by area where children grew up. And so where patenters are born and live tends to influence where the next generation of patent creators will be born and will live. And so as more workers have moved further and further away from the most religious areas of the country, they've been born in a sort of ethos of innovation that's unconnected to religion. And so we're seeing a further divergence, according to Amanda Porterfield, of the needs of corporations and the needs of religious institutions. So the second cause that I want to focus on is from Theodore Rosnack. And here we're seeing the cultural differences that have emerged in workplaces and in pews. So the focus on innovation, of challenging authority, of disrupting things, and of asking questions that are deep and profound has really become an insistence of big tech. Obviously, religious individuals ask big questions all the time, but they're of a different sort and of a different nature. And typically, Rosnack theorizes that religious individuals are more accepting of a different way of understanding the world than best aligns with the system of innovation in a more innovative America. And so corporations have, again, rewarded people in those different parts of the country who are really insistent on this STEM-based worldview. And we've seen that they've had a bit of agglomeration economies experience, where you have more and more innovative people living closer and closer together, helping companies develop more and more innovative products. And so as those agglomeration economies have grown, it's become less and less important for a lot of these corporations' bottom lines to be in places like the South or other very religious parts of the country where that innovative spirit hasn't had that generations-long compounding. And those cultural differences have really had a big ramification on encouraging corporations to just plant themselves where they know that innovative spirit is really found. So the third cause that I'd posit for the divergence in corporate and religious interests, again, comes from Rosnack. And this is focused more on the fact that big tech workers, as well as more religious individuals in the South or other parts of the country, are all, like I said earlier, focused on finding a way to understand the world. But Rosnack points out that the way of understanding the world for a lot of tech workers has begun to look a lot like a religion. There's a sort of cult of information where people have begun to uphold people like Steve Jobs, for example, as people with very clear codes, moral codes of thinking about the world that deserve study, that deserve emulation. And we begin to have these sorts of prophets of a very technological centric way of thinking about the world. And over time, we may begin to see more and more individuals align their worldviews and align their spiritual views with an insistence on the use of technology and on reliance on information and data. And so the more that religious individuals insist on their kind of hard religious views, and the more that innovation economy workers develop their own counter to that sort of religious organization by developing their own spiritual organizations that insist on a cult of information, then we'll continue to see this divergence really deepen, because there'll be less of a cultural fit between the more innovative parts of the country, as measured by STEM holders and patent holders, and the more religious parts of the country. There's also the fact that this divergence is likely to continue. We see that the more technology-focused generations like Gen Z are further detaching themselves from some of the causes that are perhaps more antithetical to a conservative worldview. Obviously, this isn't to say that every religion and religious group is conservative, but as I describe in my paper, there often tends to be a correlation between religiosity and a more conservative perspective. So we're seeing that just as innovative cultural ideas have been passed down from generation to generation, a lack of religiosity is also being passed down from generation to generation. So Gen Zers are being born to families with fewer religious ties, often in parts of the country that are home to big tech companies or a tech focus. They're moving in and then marrying eventually non-religious partners. And we're seeing a shift among this generation in terms of how they regard morality, kind of hinted at by Rosnack, this idea that perhaps morality can be found outside of the church and can be found in places like this cult of information, where technology is really guiding how you think about your worldviews. And as long as that's the case, and as long as individuals are finding morality outside of the church, there's less and less of a reason for corporations to spend time cultivating connections to more religious parts of the country and feeling as though their workers need some sort of religious guidance from any sort of corporate point of view. So with this insistence, though, of Gen Zers on finding spirituality somewhere, we have seen that corporate interests once again are leaning into what they think may be helpful to their bottom line. So it's not that corporations are antithetical to religious organizations necessarily. They're just the biggest proponent of what will do the most to help their workers be as innovative now as possible. And we're finding that things like a focus on spirituality by fostering ESG initiatives within corporations, diversity, and aligning both work and play and work and spirituality can be beneficial from a corporate's perspective, from a corporation's perspective. And so by having a morning yoga class, for example, that's backed up by research that says that people spending more time outside or in a group setting doing a physical activity may later be more collaborative and innovative, again, aligns that sort of spirituality with the new corporate interest and insistence on innovation. So I venture to say that we're only going to see a greater alignment of spirituality exercises like this morning yoga class and other programs continue to emerge in corporations as they try to foster whatever they think will do the most to encourage innovation among their employees. And we'll also probably continue to see tech companies cluster where these agglomeration economies have already developed. Absent new institutions developing, let's say in the South, that really build up a broader STEM workforce in that part of the country, there's again just less of a reason for corporations to move to these areas where innovation isn't something that's as prevalent as in other parts of the country. So although we've seen some corporations such as Airbnb move into areas of the South like Atlanta, that's still indicative of the fact that tech companies are looking for big metro areas where the odds are higher that they'll find people who probably statistically have less ties to religious organizations and more deep backgrounds in innovation, in science, in mathematics. And so over time, we'll just continue to see these agglomeration economies really harden. Even with the proliferation of Zoom and remote work, tech workers will surround themselves with tech workers and vice versa. And so the result may be a sort of cultural isolation that just continues to develop as people look for other individuals that share their spirituality or their religion. And over time, if religious views aren't passed on to the next generation, and the next generation is instead continuing to pursue these ideas of spirituality, then we may also see the decay of some of these religious institutions as we know them today. So thank you for the chance to present this paper, and please feel free to send me any and all questions. I look forward to hearing from you, and I hope you have a great rest of the conference. Thank you.
So thank you to Kevin. I'll now turn the floor over to Professor Hymes. Although Kevin is not in the room, these sessions are recorded, so he'll see any response you offer as well. And that goes the same for questions later from those assembled here, in addition to Father Hymes. So Father Hymes, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Zach. Again, I mentioned earlier before if some people came on, I apologize. My voice is raspy. I'm having some sort of reaction to the foul weather up here in Massachusetts, but it's not a sore throat, and it's not COVID, and you won't be contacting me through virtually, so you're all free and safe and need not be masked as I speak. I want to thank both Martin and Kevin for their papers, and especially for their oral remarks, which I found very helpful and which introduced some a bit more complexity than in their written papers. What I'm going to do is go through each paper and raise up questions that I have. I do have a number of comments and questions to make, and I'll register them by walking people through the papers, not the slides that Martin employed and that Kevin employed. But I'll try to quote the passages from the papers that I'm referring to so that even our other listeners can understand where I'm going. But I presume Martin has a copy of his original paper that he sent to me in front of him. Following that, I'm presuming Zach will moderate us in a conversation where we can go back and forth, Martin and myself, but really Martin and other people here who were listening in as interlocutors. Let me make a comment about both papers at the outset before I move into the specifics of Martin and Kevin's paper. My first reaction was, I guess I look at footnotes right away when I get a paper. First thing I do is I look at sources. And I'd have to say that I think both Martin and Kevin are a bit too reliant at times on single sources in some of their papers. In Kevin's case, the reliance is upon a volume by Peter Williams. And in Martin's case, it's the book that he referenced by Nan-Sun Kang. I know the Williams book. I'm not familiar with Kang's book. So let me say something first about the Williams book. In the first 5 pages of his paper, Kevin describes how religion and corporate America overlapped in their interests. He has 26 footnotes in those first 5 pages. 20 of them are from the same source, Peter Williams's book, America's Religion, which is a large and well-written undergraduate textbook. The book has been credited for moving beyond earlier treatments of American religion, which basically examined Calvinist Puritanism and then later instantiations of that worldview in American Christianity. Williams's book does much better, with chapters that discuss other branches of Christianity as well as other religious traditions. Still, it must be admitted that the vast majority of the pages in Williams' book are devoted to Protestant Christianity, and within that family, white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism. Making generalized comments about American religion based on such an undergraduate textbook is a bit light in terms of establishing foundations for Kevin's thesis. Now turning to a comment about Martin's use of Kang's book, Cosmopolitan Theology. In Kang's use of the idea of natality, described by Martin as, quote, the ever-present possibility to become new, I find a certain lack of balance. Not being familiar with Kang, I don't know if this is a criticism of Kang's book or perhaps the way Martin has appropriated the book. But in the description of the human person and the emphasis on, quote, the ever-present possibility of the new, unquote, I find no wrestling with human finitude, human sinfulness, and the historicity that marks the human. We are fallible creatures living in time and space, and a one-sided description of the human as ever-present possibility to become new strikes me as overlooking balancing elements of the human condition that address limits and possibilities foreclosed by the facticity of our creatureliness and the influence of sinfulness. Both Martin and Kevin make a case which they state strongly. And in both cases, I do think at times you go beyond the evidence that you present. This is a fairly common mistake. We all feel strongly sometimes about certain things, and we want to either support our view or take down the opposing view. But our conclusions, even when intuitively plausible, are only going to be as persuasive to others as the arguments we make. I think both Martin and Kevin suggest conclusions that go a bit beyond the rationales they present to their reader. So let me turn now to specific comments, and I'll begin with Martin since he's here in front of me. First, just to be clear about this term sovereignty that we're using, that Martin uses. As he mentions, sovereignty has to do with supreme authority in a given space. It has to do with the ability to make laws within that space. And it's not associated with any one form of government. Monarchs can be sovereign, parliaments can be sovereign, people's councils can be sovereign, panels of jurors can be sovereign. So it's not associated with any one form of government, but it does maintain that there must be one source of lawmaking within a territory. The corollary is what's called the principle of non-interference from without. And implied in that, as we see this in the UN Charter, is the belief in the equality of states. States do not have differing degrees of sovereignty. They all have a claim on non-interference. They all have a claim on the ability to make laws from within their territory. Theoretically, sovereignty should be de jure, recognized legally, and de facto in practice. But of course, that is not always the case, as Martin himself has referenced the tragic incidents going on in the Ukraine at this moment. Martin's claim on page 1 is that the ideology of nation-state sovereignty dehumanizes immigrants. And he also says on page 2 that he won't offer a comprehensive argument to prove this, right? But in effect, he does go on to make that claim fairly strongly. On page 3, Martin adopts a rather Hobbesian view that sovereignty is, quote, a matter of legal dispensation of moral principle. He is quoting someone else here, a gentleman named Bauder, but he seemingly does so approvingly, since he does not question that claim. I do. Simply to read John Locke, or even Thomas Aquinas, or for that matter, any one of literally hundreds of medieval philosophers or theologians, will show that sovereignty does not entail legal dispensation from moral principle. Indeed, no one who espouses any sort of natural law approach to political authority, which was the dominant school of thought for centuries throughout Christianity, permits the sovereign authority to put itself outside or above moral principle. Biblically, there is no support for such a notion, as the kings of Judah and Israel were always understood as Yahweh's viceroys and always subject to God's law. Thinkers like Richard Hooker during the Elizabethan settlement prior to Hobbes, and Locke after Hobbes, not to mention people like Francis Hutcheson and others of the Scottish Enlightenment, all thought that sovereign governments did not entail ignoring moral principle or being exempt from it. One could easily cite later figures in the subsequent centuries that would challenge the Hobbesian view of Bauder that Martin appears to accept. On page 5, at the top, Martin states, quote, the territorial boundary of the state becomes the boundary of the nation as a political, cultural community, unquote. I'd have to say that if you talked to the Kurds or the Serbs or the Jews or the Irish, among other peoples, they would question that. State boundaries do not encapsulate a nation. Many states are not composed of one nation, and many nations do not have a state, but are spread across the boundaries of multiple states. Martin also makes the claim that state sovereignty entails territorial inviolability, which means that outsiders should not interfere with the internal affairs of the nation. Such a claim of non-interference is, and has always been, a general norm that demands extensive nuance. And I think not so much in his paper, but in his oral remarks, Martin indicated that today. Just think of the debate over the UN doctrine of the responsibility to protect following the Rwanda genocide. By the way, that debate also gives the lie to the claim that the sovereign state is not bound by moral principle. Think also of the reality of globalization. What country's economy is not open to interference by external actors? The entire sanctions regime now being put in place regarding Russia is about interference in their economy. Think too about movies, the internet, humanitarian NGOs, multinational corporations, the World Trade Organization, the European Union. The many ways that outsiders interfere and influence the domestic life of a nation is extensive. In the face of such nuanced rendering of sovereignty, Martin's claim that sovereignty implies sacrosanct and inviolable national identity strikes me as somewhat unrealistic. On page 6, Martin, quoting Sato, approvingly states that, quote, assimilation imposes a cultural homogeneity that strips people of languages, cultures, histories, and epistemologies that diverge from those of the settler class, unquote. I agree with the claim that assimilation has played a significant role in American political thought, but I'm not persuaded it is quite the monolithic and powerful presence that it is able to, quote, impose a requirement that strips immigrants of their identities. Martin also somewhat confusedly equates assimilation, a cultural process, with political allegiance when he quotes Newt Gingrich on the topic of allegiancy to the US Constitution. Allegiancy is not the same as assimilation. Now, I have no interest in defending Newt Gingrich, a man who I generally find quite wrong-headed, but I think we need to quote him and be fair to him in the way we treat him. Page 7. Martin sees that accepting American identity means insisting that immigrants convert to a sacrosanct national identity that is based on national sovereignty, that this, quote, presumes that the integrity and purity of the American nation as a cultural political community should be inviolable. But who really holds this view? What percentage of the American people really hold to such a view? What I think is the problem is that Martin's view of assimilation, and it may be because he's quoting Bowder and others here, but that this view of assimilation is binary, when in reality, any social scientist will treat it as fluid. Assimilation is not simply imposed. For many, it is chosen. The old argument that assimilation is generally a 3-generation process remains fairly accurate. The first generation rarely assimilates, but adapts to new surroundings to the extent necessary to succeed economically, which may or may not involve speaking English, but rarely entails giving up one's religious convictions, one's diet, one's music, literature, or family traditions. A second generation is often caught in the delicate and sometimes difficult striking of a balance between fidelity to parents and desire to belong more fully in a wider culture. Decisions are made about friendships, marriage, careers, education, religious participation, and the like. They are not imposed, but they do require choices that can separate the second generation from some of the ways of the first. The third generation is often even more fully engaged by the wider culture and less concerned with the culture of grandparents. I lived for a time in a Bronx neighborhood that was largely Puerto Rican, where grandchildren could not speak easily with grandparents because they knew no Spanish, and the grandparents had little English fluency. These changes are not imposed from on high by some sacrosanct office of American national identity, but rather adopted and adapted by countless individual decisions made by immigrant populations. I emphasize adapted as well as adopted because the process is mutual. Millions of German, Irish, Italian, Polish, French Canadian, Hungarian, and other European immigrants were both changed by the culture of their host country, but they also changed that culture. There is no reason to think that the same will not happen with the large numbers of immigrants from non-European cultures coming to the United States now. Assimilation is a reciprocal process. It is far more fluid and mutual than the portrayal of it in Martin's paper. Hence, I find myself disagreeing with Martin's claim, one, that nation-state sovereignty sacralizes the national identity, and two, that it mandates xenophobic assimilation. At the bottom of the page, Martin presents the heart of his argument, page 12. Quote, unfortunately, nation-state sovereignty makes defending the sacrosanctity of the existing national identity a necessary condition for maintaining the integrity of the nation, which strips immigrants of their divinely endowed right to freely be an essence of image bearers of God. It's a complex sentence, but I find it a dubious claim that national sovereignty necessarily entails the defending of sacrosanct existing national identity. I find it dubious that such an inviolable national identity is really needed to maintain a nation's integrity. And I think Martin's concern about national identity stripping an immigrant's right to be an image bearer of God is mistaken. This concern that Martin expresses about adequate respect and protection of immigrants is admirable. I share them, and I do not question the passion or the generosity of spirit that Martin's paper reflects as he seeks to analyze what is going on in our present situation. Honest disagreement about the analysis of a problem is not the same as opposition to acknowledging the problem or disinterest in finding a remedy to address it. I simply mean to point out that what I see as claims that will not advance are discovering the proper remedy. Let me turn now briefly to Kevin's paper on why corporate America left religion. I'm going to follow the same approach as I did with Martin. On page 5, Kevin wants to show the ties between American religion, read white Anglo-Saxon Protestant religion, and American corporations that once existed have now been severed. He considers 3 theories for this development. At the outset, he makes a comment I find odd. Quote, on the tales of the rise and fall of prohibition, pluralism and secularism swept into the US as a wave of new migrants settled in cities and shifted the demographics and culture of increasingly powerful urban environments, unquote. I call this comment odd because the 18th Amendment to the Constitution was effective from the time of the Volstead Act in 1920 until the repeal of that amendment in 1933. However, significant immigration to the United States began in 1820, 100 years prior to Prohibition. The Irish began arriving in the 1820s, and by the 1840s, German immigration was becoming larger than Irish. In 1880, Italian immigration began in large numbers, even as the Irish and the Germans kept coming. French Canadians and Poles also started coming in numbers in the 1880s. Indeed, it was the 1880 census that revealed Americans were now working in non-agricultural fields more than on farms. Urbanization came long before Prohibition. The first 2 decades of the 20th century saw substantial immigration from Hungary and other Central and East European countries, even while the Irish, the Germans, the Italians, the Poles kept coming. In fact, The first bill restricting immigration, the Johnson Act, was passed in the 1920s. In other words, the idea that it was after Prohibition that the US became pluralistic seems to fly in the face of the historical record. That America became more secular after Prohibition may be true, but even here, I think the real process of secularization, I would argue, came after World War II, not after Prohibition. The confusion about time periods is also evident in the claim that radio, tabloid newspapers, and movies lessened religion's hold on mass culture. Kevin cites Billy Sunday as being a primary source of mass culture. I'm not convinced of that, nor is it crystal clear that the popularity of radio did in religion, given the influence of figures like Charles Coughlin in the early 30s and 40s, and after him, Fulton Sheen. In the same paragraph, Kevin also talks about the exportation of jobs and corporations moving overseas. But this was certainly a characteristic of the economy of the late 20th century, not the first half of it. Kevin makes several claims in closing, such as more religious individuals are disproportionately unlikely, he says this on page 11, to possess the attributes typical of people who are innovators, and that this has widened the gap between religion and business. On page 12, he cites a Pew study that, quote, the general finding is that more education is correlated with less religion, unquote. However, the study explicitly notes that this finding does not hold true for Christians, which is still the largest segment of the religious population in America. The generalized claims and the misreading of some of the data in his notes undercuts the case he wishes to make. In conclusion, Kevin states that the widening gulf between religious organizations in corporate America has troubling implications for people who live in regions with high religious practice. That is because jobs are being created in the least religious areas of the country, and that therefore religious leaders may now turn to populist measures to attract their congregants. I see several problems here. First, Kevin's paper demonstrates, I think, the danger of post hoc propter hoc thinking. That is, to say that something happened after X is not the same as saying it happened because of X. Secondly, Kevin seems to presume that American religious institutions will suffer because they are not better aligned with, quote, corporate needs and cultural expectations, unquote. But there are a number of us who would be happy if religion was not closely identified with corporate expectations, because we see a culture that has created deep inequalities and increasing harms to a large percentage of the US population to be incongruent with our religious sensibilities. That is, I am unconvinced that Kevin has made the case corporate America was once closely tied to American religion and is no longer. But even if he is correct, I am also unconvinced that would be a bad thing for American religion. Let me stop there. Again, let me just end by saying thank you to Martin and to Kevin for their papers, and I look forward to any comments or response that Martin would like to add at this time. So over to you, Zach.
Yes, I'll let Martin have the first comment here. You're welcome to sort of continue the conversation between the two of you. We're not terribly bound by time. We've got plenty, so feel free to have a conversation.
Thank you, Father Himes, for your very thoughtful, thorough comments, and I really appreciate, especially the way you started the footnote part. Really, it's something that, as a new academic, it's something that is easily overlooked because, writing student paper, we don't often pay that much attention to it. So thank you for the advice. And then, yeah, made me realize the paper version between and what I just presented is actually two add much more nuance to it, because as I was preparing for this presentation, I was like, oh, there are spots I need to fill in, I need to change, and then the logic flows better, I think, in my presentation. But then I still like to, I think I would just go into responding some of what you said, and then we can maybe have a more deep conversation and including other audiences. So firstly, I think in terms of the sovereignty part, I've read scholars who would say like sovereignty should be kind of like taking into moral considerations and stuff like that. But then I think as it is practiced right now, it is more in line with what Carl Schmitz is doing. Like he said, it's like sovereign is the one who defines the exception, and it's like above morality. And then in America, what they did to immigrants in the past decades or even past 100 years, it reflects that they have the plenary power doctrine. So they basically can do whatever they want, and it's sanctioned by the federal government, sanctioned by the Supreme Court to empower the federal government to basically do whatever they want to immigrants. And we have seen that actually played out. And so I think perhaps I shouldn't make the case, generalize it across the world, but then in America, as we have seen today, it seems like sovereignty does imply that, at least on the immigrant front. And let's see. And in terms of the political allegiance question, I think maybe I didn't make it clear in the paper, which I agree that my paper wasn't that well argued, and I'm making too big of a claim with the evidence I have. And so thank you for that reminder. But then in terms of, because I was trying to articulate that therefore immigrants are being kind of mandated to change their, like to kind of get rid of part of their identity regarding political allegiances. And I think you're right that political allegiance is perhaps different from cultural identities, but then political identities is certainly part of it. And then, but then they are being like basically dual national identities or national allegiance are being kind of prohibited, at least on an ideological front, and is seen as kind of unloyal to America. It's bad. And so I think this kind of narrative is, I believe people should have the right to have their own political allegiances. And then of course it's not just like I just want to be who I am, but then it's a negotiation process with the community around them. If their identities is actually hurting people around them, they need to negotiate. Like for example, I'll use the Taiwanese and the PRC example because I'm more familiar with that. So for if a Taiwanese person hear that mainland Chinese immigrants say that, oh, Taiwan is a part of PRC, this actually, for some Taiwanese, it hurts them. For many, it hurts them because it's their identity. But then at the same time, for the Taiwanese to say that you should not be proud, you are cheating Taiwan by holding on to your national identity, that at the same time is hurting that PRC immigrant as well. And so I think there needs to be more ground between these two identities to negotiate, to take care of the other person's kind of concern. It's more about building a relationship and then having a more fluid identity. It's not so much that, I'll stop at this point. And then in terms of the assimilation question, I would say even though immigrants they do make the choices to assimilate, but then there is a pressure that if they don't assimilate, they won't be able to blend in or kind of succeed in a mainstream culture. They have to, like, for example, if you don't speak English, you really can't, it's very hard to succeed in America, at least in a kind of like normal way. And so I think that's a pressure that's pressed upon them that forces them to assimilate. And then, of course, for Asian Americans, there's always a perpetual foreigner. They have to be as American as they are. If not, they'll always be seen as foreign. I think that's kind of motivating my claim behind assimilation, that it's more imposed not through legal means, but through social pressure by the dominant culture.
I appreciate those responses, Martin, very much. Let me just, to keep the conversation going, I'm not familiar with the Taiwanese situation that you described, but I did have a thought about it as I read your paper, and that is this. Many African nations in the post-colonial era became very strong in promoting programs of nationalism.
Yeah.
Now, after the experience of World War II, many Western nations were uncomfortable with the language of nationalism. We had just slaughtered millions or hundreds of thousands over this, and millions really. And so nationalism was a kind of a bad word. But the situation in Africa was these new states being created, many of which crossed tribal boundaries and tribal loyalties, threw tribes together that may have been rivals in the past, divided some tribes across borders. And so because of that, there was this effort in the post-colonial era for that first generation of African leaders to really promote nationalism, because they had to find some way of developing commonalities where there had not been such, and in trying to foster a sense of pride and unity around the nation. As a long-term policy, probably not a healthy idea, but in the immediate historical context, it may have been a sensible choice to make. And I ask you this, is that something along the lines of maybe what was going on with Taiwan, that here is a small island nation trying to develop a sense of itself and bring together people? And yes, granted, there are obviously going to be people with ties and loyalties to people back on the mainland, but was the conscious effort, as you say, to sort of discourage people from thinking that way or acting that way? Was it in your mind a completely unacceptable idea, or was it at least an arguably reasonable government policy, at least for a time, as Taiwan is trying to forge its sense of itself distinct from the mainland Chinese people? I just would like your comments on that, because I don't know the Taiwanese situation, but would there be a parallel to the post-colonial African situation?
I do think there is a parallel here, especially like that's why towards the end of my presentation and paper, I was wrestling with the idea of, so it's very important. Like, for example, if Ukraine don't rally around to defend itself against Russia, then its identity is going to be wiped out. So like Russia is trying to make everybody Russian in Ukraine. And so similarly in like colonial context and perhaps in the Taiwanese context as well. And so I do see there, I think this Kang's idea on solidarity as authority is very important, or in the essential commonality. Like when there is, it's important to rally around causes or common identities that are advancing, kind of like protecting self-determination, trying to, because sometimes if you don't do it, then the identities is going to be wiped out and people cannot flourish. And because it's part of who they are, and they're going to be subsumed by the sovereignty of another nation state. And so I do see the value in that. But then at the same time, so my fundamental question is whether it's possible to do self-determination without sovereignty. Mm-hmm. And my answer is sadly no, that we really do need sovereignty right now, at least in this world currently, to protect the self-determination right of kind of weaker nation. But then this is from a more macro point of view, but then for immigrants who come in, like people from mainland who come in who want to live in Taiwan because they love their husband, their wife, they are willing to migrate to live with them, and then even claim this island as their home. But then, because some of the interviews I didn't quote, they said, that's my home. Like, I grew up there. Like, I got the education. So it's part of who they are. And then it seems like the state, because of this nation building project, is discriminated against them, are calling them enemies. And then they couldn't, like, if they could express their loyalty to, they're saying, look, I believe that the island and the mainland should be one. And then the other people, what's their reaction? Should their reaction be like, oh, you're the enemy, or let's talk? I think under sovereignty, it's more, you're the enemy, but rather it should more be like, let's talk.
Mhm.
And then, so I think that's where I'm getting to.
Yeah, that makes perfectly good sense to me. Michael Walzer talks about that the whole purpose of territorial integrity that comes with sovereignty is really to allow communal self-determination. That's really the issue. And I think what I think is behind your paper, that I think I agree with the nub of your argument. I'm not, again, I had problems with the sort of absoluteness with the way you express things, but behind it, I think, is really the argument that communal self-determination should be open rather than too inward looking and too exclusive and prone to marginalization. That it should be an open process of self-determination that welcomes the other and lets the other enrich the community, even as the community wants to pass on something to the newcomer. That sort of thing I agree with completely. I totally agree with that kind of vision. I don't think, though, that granting territorial integrity necessarily means you get a closed communal self-determination. I think you can argue for a richer, more complex notion of the community, which I think is really at the heart of what you're arguing for. I just think linking that too much to the argument that sovereignty is a mistake because territorial integrity is a mistake, because that leads to absolutizing a given identity. I think those kinds of claims are just too strong and too intimately linked in your thinking. But I do believe your project is, I support fully. Let me go back just to the other point about allegiance and assimilation, because I think we have to say the allegiance argument is different than the assimilation argument. If you wanted to put it this way, the allegiance argument is about political loyalty. The assimilation argument is a cultural process of coming to identity, right? What Gingrich was saying, he wasn't talking about the cultural process. He was talking about Americans have to pledge allegiance to the US Constitution. And anyone who won't do that is not fully American, because you're not pledging your allegiance to the government that supports the US Constitution. Now, so I think in fairness to him, you shouldn't have lumped him in with in the assimilation section. He's not talking about assimilation. But I'd go so far as to say even his view of allegiance here is mistaken, because let's consider the present situation. Already today, I've gotten 3 appeals this morning already for people trying to raise funds and support for the Ukraine, right? For people to give money to the Ukraine and support the Ukraine in various ways. 2 of the 3 are from people who are of Ukrainian descent, right? Are they non-allegiant to the United States because they also have some sense of allegiance and fidelity and loyalty to the Ukraine? I think that's nonsense, right? So I think Gingrich is being too absolutist as well in all this, So I think we can have degrees of allegiance, right? Just as we have degrees of assimilation. And my only point is that I think the way, and it may be just because of the people you read who influenced your thinking here more than what you're saying, but I do think this kind of way of seeing assimilation as an all or nothing, that either you become this American, which means strip yourself of all your past, and that's imposed on people, and that's the language that Bowie uses, impose, right? That's very different, I think, than the empirical reality of how assimilation actually works in the lives of people. It's a much more fluid process. And at the macro level, it's a much more reciprocal process whereby waves of immigrant peoples have clearly shaped the American identity, not just taken on a pre-existing one.
We have about 5 minutes left, and I want to open the floor to anyone who may have a question or a comment that they'd like to offer. Given the size of our group, feel free to unmute yourself and share your comment. I don't think we're going to be talking over one another. But let me also invite those who may want to speak or ask a question of Kevin to please do so, noting that it will necessarily be unanswered today, however, for his own benefit at the later time watching these recordings. So Professor McCannon.
Yes, thank you so much, Martin and Kevin and Professor Himes for a really stimulating session. My question is for you, Martin. I really enjoyed and appreciated your paper, in part because I am very wary of nation states. I am looking forward to the time, I probably won't live to see it, when humanity comes up with something better, because I do agree with you that it fundamentally distorts our sense of who we are. But I also really appreciated the qualifiers you brought in relation particularly to what's happening in Ukraine about the need for some communities to use nationalism strategically to prevent themselves from being overwhelmed by more powerful folks. What I wonder, though, is in a situation like the situation Ukraine is in now, is it really feasible to keep your nationalism strategic rather than absolute? I hear what the president of Ukraine is saying to rally his people in self-defense. And I can't help but think of what the president of Hungary has been saying for the past 10 years, rallying his people in memory of a similar invasion that happened 800 years ago and is now being mobilized for stuff that has nothing to do with any of that. So what advice would you offer to President Zelensky and other Ukrainians about how they can keep their nationalism strategic so that what's happening to them now is not used to justify counter atrocities a millennium into the future?
Thank you for your question, Professor McCannon. I think for it's a very big question, but my gut reaction is that it's one thing to say, like, we have to protect our nation, and then this nation is important because if it is wiped out or conquered by the Russian army, then our culture, the things we cherish, the things that make us who we are, it's going to be gone. It's going to be wiped out. And then so I think that's a strategic use of nationalism, as you said. But then if he goes on and say, let's hate Russian, then that's a different thing. And he's doing the right thing in terms of he's telling the Ukrainian citizen and the Russian citizen that it's not about a war between two people. It's not about two essentialized identities in battle that are essentially in hostility. It's about an aggression of one man or a group that is trying to achieve his political aspiration. And he does not, I don't think he's essentializing nationalism yet. Yeah, so I would say if we keep it, well, I think I would just stop. The response will stop right here because I really admire what he's doing right now. And then, so just respect to him.
Thank you very much for the question, Dr. McCannon. Thank you, Martin. I know that we're right at time, so let me offer my gratitude again to Professor Himes, to Martin, and to Kevin for their papers and the presentations and the responses. Thanks to all of you for joining us. We have a slight break now until noon before our next session begins to grab a quick bite for lunch. And I want to remind you to join us later this afternoon at 3:20, where we'll have our concluding remarks and we'll present the award for the best student paper. So please join us as you can this afternoon. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference, and we'll see you in the next session. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Zach.
much, Professor
Thank you,
Hines.
Martin. Nice reading your paper. Nice meeting.